Good morning,
Morning.
Mr. Commissioner, members. We are ready to proceed, Mr. Commissioner, and my colleague Advocate Mohapi will deal with the evidence this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Commissioner, our witness this morning, Ms. Botsang Morobe, is ready to take the prescribed oath. Ms. Morobe, you don't have any objection to taking the oath?
No, I don't, Commissioner.
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I
Raise
do.
your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated. Ms. Morobe, you've prepared a statement from which you'll be giving your evidence before the Commission. And the Commission has your statement, Ms. Morobe, paragraph 1.
I am an adult female and currently employed by the Public Investment Corporation as an associate principal in Isibaya Private Equity Structured Investment Products. I was employed by the PIC in June 2014 as an investment associate in the private equity team, and I've held various job titles and responsibilities within the same division. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Commerce degree with a double major in finance and economics, a Bachelor of Commerce honors degree in finance, and a Masters of Commerce degree in finance, all obtained from the University of Witwatersrand. I'm currently pursuing a Doctorate of Philosophy degree in finance at WITS, where I also occasionally serve as a sessional lecturer for business finance. I have successfully completed CFA Level 1. The facts contained in this statement are, to the best of my knowledge and belief, both true and correct.
Can I just ask, what does a principal or associate principal do?
So an associate principal would look through would manage the entire investment process as it relates to the DDs, which is due diligence, conducting due diligence that relate to transactions, evaluating various investment proposals, taking those proposals through to the committee, having them approved if they're favorable, and then monitoring those transactions once they have been invested into by the PIC. Further to that, we are also involved in participating in the overall structure of investments at the PIC. We also participate in negotiating legal aspects of transactions.
Yeah. Ms. Morobe, yeah.
Yes.
Just a quick check. It's been a while, you know. The Masters of Commerce at WITS, is that coursework and dissertation, or is just a, yeah, you know?
Well, there's an option to actually do it 100% coursework. The one that I'd done was a dissertation as well as a bit of coursework.
And then the PhD, which area of finance are you dealing with? What's your topic there?
So it's very conceptual at the moment. I'm in the process of submitting my proposal to the Faculty of Finance. But overall, the concept is to actually assess the private equity model, which is seen to be very successful in Europe and the West. But based on African businesses that obviously have their own nuances, I would like to test whether being replicated in the African context is that successful, or whether there needs to be variations to that model. So I intend to add to the body of knowledge in that regard. But as I said, Commissioner, through you, this is something that's quite conceptual, and developing that proposal.
Quite interesting work, looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Let's carry on, please. Paragraph 4.
I have been requested to give evidence in relation to my role in Project Sierra and Project Bluebuck. Collectively, I'll refer to them as the transactions.
Now, just before we proceed further, because you are the first witness testifying on this particular deal, can you just briefly explain to the Commission what this is, what we refer to as Project Sierra and Project Bluebuck?
Through you, Commissioner. So in 2016, the PIC was approached by Lancaster Group to help in the facilitation of Lancaster acquiring shares in Steinhoff. So how the PIC helped with this facilitation, we advanced a loan of 9.35 billion to Lancaster Group to acquire about 2.75% shares in Steinhoff. This loan was then backed by security in the form of a ratio collar. That ratio collar then provided a downside protection to the PIC. We also had primary cession on some of the shares that were bought, and as a result, that transaction was concluded. A year down the line after concluding that transaction, the share price in Steinhoff actually began to decline, and therefore the security package that was pledged, which included Steinhoff shares, was becoming inadequate. And to that regard, there was a need to do Project Bluebuck, where Lancaster actually went and got a loan from Citibank and bought shares in Star, which is now called Pepco. Those shares were then pledged to the PIC as security in order to enhance our security package. So those are the two transactions and pretty much the rationale on why they were done.
Thank you, Ms. Morobe. Let's continue.
In May 2016, I was tasked to work on Project Sierra in my capacity as an investment associate. I received a copy of an investment proposal prepared by Symphony Capital, dated 11 May 2016 from Mervyn Muller, who was the acting executive head of private equity and SIPs at the time. I cannot confirm how the transaction was originated and whether there had been prior iterations of the investment proposal before my involvement. Soon after I was made aware of the transaction, I attended a meeting around 20th May 2016 between the PIC and Symphony, where an overview of the envisaged transaction was presented by Symphony. The investment proposal in paragraph 5 formed the basis of discussions at this meeting, which I deemed an introductory briefing for myself, as I had just started working on the transaction. From that meeting onwards, several discussions were had between the PIC and Symphony, and various iterations of the investment proposal and financial models were provided by Symphony.
Sorry, can I just ask, was this your first interaction with Symphony?
Commissioner, through you, yes, it was.
And were you aware whether PIC had other previous engagements with Symphony?
Not at the time, Commissioner, but I later learned that there were other transactions that the PIC was doing with Symphony.
Thanks.
So, for the record, Symphony is what? An advisor?
Symphony is an advisor, Commissioner. At this point, the transaction team had begun to analyze and interrogate the proposal at hand in order to reach a point where it could produce an appraisal report to present to the Portfolio Management Committee.
I just think maybe once again try to give us the difference between private equity and SIPs in the PIC. What's the main differences there?
So there is an allocation in terms of the client mandate that is given to private equity. That mandate, as it stands in the current fund, we have about 15 billion rands worth of funds to deploy in private equity transactions. That would be typically you would fund a sponsor, or we would go in directly into an unlisted company with the aim of growing that company and adding some value add. and exiting at a later stage, actually not more than 10 years into that underlying portfolio company, and having, I think our returns as per amended would be an IRR above 25%. So that's our private equity mandate.
So it's sort of buyout capital and sort of growth capital
It
around
would be,
it. Yeah.
so we actually do both growth capital and replacement capital in some instances.
Yes, yes. And then SIPs?
SIPs, my understanding is that there is also an allocation from the underlying client, which is the GEPF, to do transactions in structured investment portfolios. How this typically works out is we would then facilitate the entrance of an empowerment party or a BE party into a transaction. This transaction would be backed by some form of derivative. So it could happen in two forms. We could either provide a loan to a sponsor, and we would get a put option or a CRO, or a contingent repurchase obligation, or a collar ratio, which is really a mechanism in which we protect our downside. Another way in which we can actually facilitate a SIP transaction is on the opposite end, where a sponsor obtains funding from third parties, and then we provide that downside protection to the third-party funders. Typically, this is useful in the sponsor getting attractive funding rates from third parties. So that is my understanding of how we would do structured investment product transactions.
And private equity does not include funds of funds, which is a separate matter, is it?
Prior to, I think, maybe a year or two ago, fund of funds used to sit under the private equity allocation. It has since then been removed, and I think it sits under research.
Okay, all right, okay.
Thank you. Let's carry on, paragraph 8.
From that meeting onwards, several discussions were had between the PIC and Symphony, and
Sorry, paragraph 8.
in my understanding, in terms of the governance process for approving transactions, the transaction team is required to seek approval to embark on a due diligence process, on a due diligence from PMC 1. Post the due diligence exercise, the transaction would then be taken to PMC 2 to be declined if it's not favorable, or approved to proceed to IC or the fund investment panel for final approval if it is favorable. According to my knowledge, at the time of the transaction, due diligence exercises on SIP transactions where the target company was listed on the stock exchange would not require the appointment of external due diligence service providers, as the information was publicly available and has been regarded as sufficient for the PIC's internal teams to perform an extensive due diligence at no additional cost to the organization. It is for this reason that I believe Project Sierra was taken directly to PMC 2 to request to proceed to IC for final approval. Project Sierra was therefore presented at PMC 2 on 18th July 2016. The proposal was taken to PMC 2. The proposal that was taken to PMC 2 was for the PIC to advance a loan of 10.4 billion to Lancaster Group for the acquisition of a 3% stake in Steinhoff International Holdings. The security package for the loan included a ratio collar from Citibank, cession and pledge of the Steinhoff shares owned by Lancaster Group, and dividends from the non-Delta shares to repay the PIC loan.
Can I ask you, in terms of paragraph 9 in your last sentence, it's PMC 2 to request to proceed to the investment committee for final approval. If I recall correctly, the delegation of authority is you can go to investment committee up to 10 billion. This was 10.4 billion rand, and therefore IC could not give the final approval on that amount. It would have to go to the board. Is that the reason why it became 9.4? Was there any reason where R1 billion suddenly disappeared to?
Commissioner, through you, the initial transaction was for 10.4 billion. Assuming that it had passed IC level, it would then have gone to board for final approval. That quantum was then changed to 9.3 billion. I am not sure why it was changed to 9.3 billion.
But that would bring it then into the ambit of a DOA that does no longer need to go to the board.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Okay. And perhaps if you could just deal with the question of the last sentence in paragraph 10, the security package, and obviously you didn't deal with the collar, which I think you come back to later, the cession and pledge of the Steinhoff shares, and how that cession and pledge of the Steinhoff shares was going to work? Or do you cover that? And I think you do cover it later, but whether you want to wait till later or you want to deal with it now?
I can do it now, Commissioner. So there was three forms of security, one which relates to the collar, which provided downside protection. The second part was that there were two classes of shares that were acquired. There were the non-delta shares that were acquired from Steinhoff, and there were the delta shares that were acquired from Citibank. Those delta shares were necessary to actually keep the collar in place. So that is the whole purpose for having the delta shares. So they were meant to actually maintain the ratio collar. At the time, 25% of those shares from the non-collar shares would have had, PIC would have had primary cession and pledge over. Citibank would then have primary cession of the 75 shares. And that is because Citi had, the ratio collar, the way it was designed, PIC, well, Lancaster Group had paid a premium of about 250 for that. That premium would have been higher if there was a put option, and maybe I can just elaborate on what a put option is. A put option is a mechanism where you have absolute downside protection and unlimited upside protection. It is typically quite a costly structure to put in place. In this instance, it would have meant Lancaster Group would have paid more for a put option. So how it was facilitated that to bring down the premium of the put option, Lancaster Group actually sold collars to Citi. And what meant is that Citi then participated in the upside that would have only been attributable to Lancaster Group and PIC. So the upside that was sold to Citi as a result was 75%, and that is why the underlying shares in Steinhoff, 75% of them were then pledged to Citi. PIC then had a reversionary on the 75% of the shares that were pledged as primary to Citi. The third component of security was that of the shares that PIC had a primary cession and pledge of, which is the 25% shares, PIC then had dividends, could then get the dividends that would then service their loan to Lancaster.
So this was the initial structure, and the MPC2 and the investment committee were happy with that?
That was the initial structure, Commissioner. I don't think the mechanics of the structure changed during this approval. What was evident was the change came from the quantum, as well as the inclusion of a broad-based component within the transaction, which I cover at a later stage.
Can I just take you to that paragraph 9 again?
Okay.
Where you give an explanation for a transaction to go directly to PMC2. And then in your last sentence, you say, it is for this reason that I believe that Project Sierra was taken to PMC2. Is it an assumption that you're making, or is it fact that you know that is so?
Thank you, Commissioner. So typically when we do these transactions, there's a delegation of authority that we follow. There is no clear delegation of authority that we follow for structured investment products. What experience has taught us in the past, or what we've learned from experience, is that to the extent that there aren't costs incurred by the PIC, and to the extent that all the information is public and the deal teams are able to use that information to assess the underlying transaction and company, then we can skip the PMC 1 stage. But that was never actually put on paper. It is just the principle that was carried out at the time.
And you believe that that is the reason why it had gone directly to PMC 2?
Commissioner, I do believe that is the reason.
If I can just understand this, Ms. Morobia. So PMC 1, what is the purpose of that? Is that to approve expenditure that goes towards due diligence exercises?
Commissioner, through you, yes. So the purpose of PMC 1 is obviously to assess the mandate, if there's a mandate fit, and if there's an overall appetite for the transaction. And once there's a feeling that the transaction is aligned to our mandate, then there's a need to do further work. To the extent that there is going to be costs incurred, then the PMC has to approve those costs.
Yeah. To follow up on paragraph 9, one would assume that when Steinhoff, that particular point in time, you had some research on Steinhoff and in the research portal or something. What was, and then there were probably deep dive reports too, you know, because it's not, you cannot do a DD on a listed company generally. Is that correct?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct.
Yeah, yeah. What was the house view on Steinhoff at that time? Was it a buy? Was it a sell? You know, because it looks like even on the listed side, there was some buy stuff around it.
Commissioner, through you, at the time when we concluded the transaction, or at the time when we were considering the transaction, there was a view that the asset was a buy. That was mainly driven on the fact that when we looked at the growth of the share price over the last 5 years, it had shown significant growth. I think, if I recall at the top of my head, it would have been something like 35% compounded return over a 5-year period. Also, Steinhoff at the time had been reporting positive earnings and paying out dividends. So it was our view that when we projected the dividends and projected Steinhoff earnings, we would then get a return that was in line with our mandate. So at the time, even outside of our own internal house views, we did look at what other analysts had been reporting, and I think out of the consensus, we got about 75% buys and probably 1 hold at the time. I don't quite recall the stats, but there was an appetite to buy the stock.
And probably it's why this didn't go to PMC 1, because there was quite some research on the company.
Commissioner, through you, yes, it was a widely covered stock, and we had all the data and all the consensus reports to assess it.
Okay, then you've just also referred to non-delta and delta shares. Can you please explain those two concepts?
So, Commissioner, through you, in relation to this transaction, the delta shares that are being referred to were the shares that were actually bought from Citi, and they were the shares that would then be used to maintain the ratio collar. The non-delta shares were the shares that were then bought from Steinhoff. These shares had voting pool rights attached to them, and a portion of them, about 25% of them, would then not be lent out at any particular time to maintain this ratio collar.
Thank you. Let's carry on. Paragraph 11.
Project Sierra was taken to a series of IC meetings for consideration. During these meetings, the committee members were not completely satisfied with the transaction and required the transaction team to do additional work. According to some of my notes from the IC meetings that I attended, the additional work that had to be provided by the transaction team included, but not limited to, submission of more information on the Lancaster Group, performing an enhanced due diligence on Jayendra Naidu as he was considered a politically exposed person.
Sorry, on that question of a PEP, was there a PIC policy at that time on PEPs and how they should be dealt with?
Commissioner, through you, I don't recall if it's a policy or if it's a guideline, but there is a way in which politically exposed persons are assessed. At the time, there was an enhanced due diligence. If I recall from those notes, and I'm trying to think at the top of my head, because of Jayendra's involvement in the unions and his involvement in the ANC alliance, he was considered a politically exposed person. I think the test at the time was to check if he could use that position still to be able to influence decision-making. And what the report had concluded was that he was not able to, or he'd been removed from the unions, and he had been removed from his interactions or his affiliations to the party, and that he was strictly involved in his business operations, and therefore he was considered a low-risk, politically exposed person. The contribution by Lancaster Group to be at least 5% of the transaction price in line with the PIC BEE policy.
Sorry, that 50 million, or that 5%, was that the 50 million loaned to Lancaster to make that funding?
So Commissioner, I've actually spotted this as a incorrect statement that I've put through. I would like the opportunity to correct it. So yes, the Lancaster Group had provided an equity contribution in the form of, we typically refer to it as skin in the game in the transaction, of 50 million rands. And this was mainly for the purposes of aligning our interests with that of Lancaster Group. There are BEE, PIC BEE guidelines that sort of govern this contribution. The guidelines refer to a contribution of between 1% to 5%. The contribution by Lancaster Group was 50 million, which was 0.5% of the transaction size and not 5%.
So repeat, are you saying it was 0.5%?
Commissioner, through you, yes, the equity contribution by Lancaster Group was 0.5%.
So the policy was between 1% and 5%?
Commissioner, through you, yes, there were guidelines to say
So
between
1 and 5%, and they contributed 0.5% at the 50 million. And was that 50 million a loan from the PIC to them?
Commissioner, through you, the 50 million from Lancaster Group was not a loan from the PIC. Commissioner, can I add to that? Parallel to that also, the PIC matched the 50 million and also contributed an equity contribution of 50 million to capitalize Lancaster 101. I think I discussed it a bit later in detail.
I'm a bit confused about which 50 million we're talking about, because I mean, it is slightly a little bit beyond, but it goes there to say, if you look at the top of page 7, Lancaster SPV would be capitalized by GPF and Lancaster Group through a contribution of 50 million each, right? So that is not the 50 million that the PIC put in.
Commissioner, through you, that is the 50 million.
That is the same 50 million.
Yes.
So in essence, the PIC funded Lancaster for the 50 million of equity that they had to put in.
Commissioner, through you, there were two 50 millions, one by the PIC, one by Lancaster Group. These would then go and capitalize Lancaster 101 for working capital. Over and above that, there was a loan for 9.35 billion, which went to buying the shares as well as paying for transaction costs. So the PIC did not fund Lancaster Group for its 50 million contribution into Lancaster 101.
I just want to go back to paragraph 9, just to see if we can simplify things a bit there. Is that paragraph 9? Yeah, the funding package and all that. So in terms of a collar, coming back there. So tell me if I'm wrong. So it's really to buy protection, basically. The PIC puts money there, and then there's a call option, and it takes that premium to buy a put option, and then the payoffs are within a certain limits in terms of the share price that the PIC can benefit. Is that correct? In a nutshell, in simple English.
Commissioner, that is correct. That is correct, Commissioner. So just to elaborate further, the collar was designed in such a way that there was a floor price. Below that price, then Citi would then pay PIC its capital back. I'm just making an assumption of what would happen at maturity of this transaction. If the price was between, then there was a top price, which I'll call a ceiling price. If the price was above that, then Citi would participate in the upside. Their participation would be limited to 75% of the upside. In between those two prices would exist a price which would then, if the position is liquidated, if the shares are sold, then the PIC would be paid in full its outstanding balance, which is the capital plus interest. In between the floor and that particular price, Lancaster Group would not participate in the upside. Anything above that price that would then pay the outstanding balance, that would do PIC good, and the ceiling price that I mentioned, Lancaster Group and PIC would participate in the upside. It would have been 50-50, I think.
Oh, okay. And it's called a zero collar because the premium and you use for the put option is the same, so the cost is zero.
No, Commissioner, through you, Commissioner. This was not actually a zero collar. This was a ratio collar. And the reason why it was a ratio collar was that the upside, so there were, in simpler terms, there was a put option that was bought for 100% of the shares. Then there was collars that were sold for 75% of the shares. That allowed Citi to then participate in 75% of the upside. Had there been call options that were sold for 100% of the shares, and Citi then participated in 100% of the upside, that would have been that zero strategy.
Yeah, I see. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The inclusion of a broad-based component to the transaction structure. The IC approved Project Sierra on 5 August 2016. Although I was not present at this final IC meeting, my understanding was that the transaction was approved under the following key parameters. The PIC was to provide a loan of 9.3 billion. Commissioner, through you, I'd like to actually say it was 9.35 billion. So the PIC to provide a loan of 9.3 billion to Lancaster SPV, a special purpose vehicle which was later registered as Lancaster 101, for the acquisition of 2.75% equity stake in Steinhoff, including transaction-related costs. The security packages under the loan entailed primary cession of 25% Steinhoff shares bought by Lancaster, PIC, and I'd like to omit that PIC. So it was primary session on 25% Steinhoff shares bought by Lancaster and a reversionary session on this remaining 75% Steinhoff shares ceded to Citibank. A session of the dividends on the non-delta shares and a session of any proceeds from the ratio collar.
Sorry, can you just read into the record the footnote to point B2?
Yes, Commissioner. The non-delta shares are the shares that the PIC had a primary session and pledge over, and these form 25% of the aggregate shares that Lancaster 101 subscribed for in Steinhoff.
So if I understand that points 1, 2, and 3 correctly, although you say this was bought by Lancaster, the question there was it was a 25% PIC and 75% Citibank in terms of the shares.
Commissioner, I need clarity on that question.
If we looked at, you say there's primary session of 25% Steinhoff shares bought by Lancaster, session 2, the PIC.
So maybe I should clarify, though, of the 100% shares that were bought,
Right.
25% were ceded to the PIC as primary.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is 25% was ceded to the PIC, 75% to Citibank.
Yes, that's correct, Commissioner.
It's important because this changes just now.
Yes.
It changes in the second tranche so that this becomes something that's quite material to the issue of security. So I just want us to be clear that it's 25% ceded to PIC, 75% to Citibank.
Yes.
Correct.
The ownership of Lancaster SPV would be 50% held by GEPF, 25% by Lancaster Group, and 25% by a broad-based Black economic group. Lancaster
Sorry, just on that question as well. At this time of approval, because here we're going to the question of approvals by the investment committee, was there any information provided to the committee on this BBBEE? Or was it in principle that there would be a 25% broad-based Black economic empowerment component, but it was not known to the investment committee what form or shape or the components of that at the time of approval?
Commissioner, through you, perhaps maybe I should just give a little bit of background as to how the trust came about. Initially, the SPV would have been PIC and Lancaster Group holding a 50-50 shareholding. I think some of the key concerns raised by the committee was that Lancaster Group was solely owned by Jayendra Naidu, and this transaction was supposed to be an empowerment transaction which had a broad-based component to it. That is how the introduction of the BBBEE trust came about. When that was then put forth in the meetings, the beneficiaries or how it would be composed, how the BEE trust would be composed, was not actually outlined. So it would then form the beneficiaries would then be part of the implementation, if I may say so.
So if I understand that correctly, the PIC imposed this component on the deal to say there must be a 25% Lancaster, 25% broad-based Black economic empowerment. It has to be set up and done and implemented by Lancaster, but it is a condition of the loan.
Correct. Commissioner, through you, it was a requirement by our committee. Lancaster SPV would be capitalized by GEPF and Lancaster Group through a contribution of 50 million each. According to the IC submission made by the transaction team at the IC meeting on 5 August 2016, I've annexed that submission, the submission is Annexure A. The following transaction costs were presented. Acquisition of shares for 9 billion, transaction costs for 10 billion, the ratio collar premium for 350 million, and I've omitted, which I should have done, the capitalization of 50 million by the PIC, and that would have totaled to 9.4 billion. In line with the implementation summary, which I've provided as Annexure B, the deposit and escrow agreement, which I have annexed as Annexure C, and the escrow payment instruction 1 and escrow payment instruction 2, which I've annexed as Annexure D and E, the following costs were paid. The acquisition of shares from Citi, which were the Delta shares, 3.91 billion was paid to Citi. Acquisition of shares from Steinhoff, non-Delta shares, 5.33 billion was paid to Steinhoff. The collar premium to Citi was paid for 250 million. Advisory fees to Symphony, 76.95 million. Payment to Lancaster Group, 22.85 million, as well as escrow agent fees to Standard Bank for 200,000 rands.
Sorry, Ms. Mrove, just going back to Table 1, transaction costs, the second row. For the record, that's 100 million.
Commissioner, through you, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
And that was paid to whom?
The transaction costs in the table below were paid to two beneficiaries, one to Symphony for the tune of 76 million, and then the other to Lancaster Group for the tune of 22 million.
Is it possible to go to those two annexures E and F and just look at that for a minute? Because that covers both of them. And in terms of the Symphony Capital, as you've indicated before, the PIC uses them has used them on a number of occasions, and I think correctly has, well, that's my opinion, leave my opinions out of it, the question of having used this, has been using advisors, transaction advisors in promoting black economic empowerment and black firms. Is that correct?
Commissioner, through you, I would like to state that for this transaction, Symphony were advisors to Lancaster Group and not the PIC.
I understand that, but you've also used them in the PIC.
We have.
And if one looks at annexure, I'm not criticizing it, I'm just asking for clarity. The question of saying, in terms of looking at Symphony, this would not look like an empowerment transaction group to me.
Commissioner, in trying to understand your question, are you...
I'm just saying that the PIC's policy has been to try to promote the use of black economic empowerment, advisory firms, trying to ensure that they are brought into the financial services sector. Here there's a huge deal, and the advisory, which may be perfectly fine, I'm not questioning that or their capability, I'm just saying that it is notable that it is not an empowerment firm, although it was not used by the PIC in this occasion. Yeah. It is a company that is used, and I'm just really creating, perhaps affirming that this is not an empowerment firm for such a big transaction.
Commissioner, through you, I'm not sure how the shareholding of Symphony looks, but at face value, the representatives of Symphony Capital would not be the faces of an empowered team.
Right. And in relation to the fees paid to Lancaster, the 22.8 million, if one could look at that, how do we know what that was used for? Because that was paid to Lancaster.
Commissioner, through you, my understanding, and I stand to be corrected, was that there were taxes that had to be paid by Lancaster Group with result of the as a result of the transaction, and there was also legal fees that would have been paid to ENS, who were representing Lancaster Group at the time. To the extent that you require the breakdown between the taxes and the ENS, I don't have that information on me at at this point in time.
I
But
think
it-
it's, sorry? Yeah.
But is that what normally happens, that the advisors of the people who brought the transaction also get paid by the PIC?
Commissioner, through you, I have seen transactions where transaction costs are capitalized to a facility that the PIC provides. So, in essence, the PIC would be funding for those advisors to be paid.
That's quite a relief, but is that the position here?
Commissioner, again, through you, typically how it works is you would see the fees broken down. There'll be a transparency of these fees, if I could say that. So there would be a whole fees agreement that outlines every advisor that contributed to the transaction. So you would typically see is you would see Symphony, you would see ENS, you would see all the advisors in one agreement, and that would be provided for everybody to see who's getting what. So that, for me, in my experience, has been the practice. I'm not sure how it was or why it was rather designed the way it was for this particular transaction.
If I could just stay with that a second, sorry, Chief. It's a question for me, because this is 100 million rand of the deal that has gone clearly to pay from the PIC to Symphony, and just under 23 million to Lancaster. And I think that I'm not asking it for the Commission's point of view, I'm asking from the PIC's point of view. Would you not have wanted a breakdown of exactly who was getting what money within that total, rather than just accept, okay, 22 million and I pay out who I need to? It's a significant amount of money. It may not be much in relation to the total of what was on the books, 9.45 billion, but it is a lot of money, still 100 million to pay out, just saying thank you to Lancaster, 23 million rand. I would have thought the PIC would query and they'd want the detail before you paid it out. And would that have been, in addition, in terms of Symphony, would that have been an agreement between Lancaster and Symphony that this would be the rate, their fees? You know, to look at it and say that's not a small fee. I'm sure they did a lot of work for it, but it's not a small fee. So if PIC is adding it in, the question I'm really asking is if PIC is adding it into what is being paid out, there should have been the agreement that could be seen between Lancaster and Symphony as to what was the basis of that fee, as well as what comprised the 23 million rand that went to Lancaster before you simply paid it out. Now, it may be somewhere else, but I haven't seen it here. And I'm just asking, as a normal procedure in approvals of the PIC, would you simply take these things at face value and not want the underlying documentation around it from a PIC governance perspective?
Commissioner, through you, there are some transactions where you would have access to the mandate agreement between the sponsor and the advisor, which would obviously outline the scope of work and the remuneration thereof. For this particular transaction, I don't recall seeing such a breakdown. What I do recall is a breakdown in the form of a spreadsheet, but and as far as the underlying supporting documents are concerned, I don't have a memory of those.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think probably the key issue here is that on that 23 million, was that only sort of legal fees, tax opinions or whatever, or is there an amount that went to Lancaster? Do you know? I think a breakdown will actually help us to just see. Because on paragraph 17, you actually give some names of the legal firms that got the money. Is that correct?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct.
Yeah, so the key thing here is that 23 million, did any part of that 23 million go to Lancaster or not, I think? Yeah? Yeah, because the other fees would be, and just the concession is that why was this breakdown? Because typically the fees are done in one batch where it's advisors, it's legal advisors, tax opinion people and all that. Is that correct? Is that correct?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct.
So I guess we should just get that breakdown on the 23 million rands.
Commissioner, through you, I can get that information. Okay.
I'm not sure that I understand the whole concept. You've got here at paragraph 14 the list of payments, right? And you say payment to Lancaster, 22.85 million. That's the figure that we're talking about. And then did Lancaster receive that, if you know, and then spread it as in F of paragraph 17? And if so, did that 23 million form part of the total amount that was paid to Lancaster or that was borrowed?
Through you, Commissioner, I will attempt to answer the first part of the question, which relates to whether the 22 million was transferred to Lancaster Group. So I have provided in Annex E payment instruction. Paragraph 3.1.2 of that refers to an amount of 22 million being the remaining balance of the deposit account to Lancaster 101 Proprietary Limited. So there was an instruction to pay out that money from the escrow account, which the monies were initially deposited in, to then pay Lancaster that money. As it relates to the relationship between the 22 million and the advisors that were paid in paragraph 17 of my statement, Clifford Chance was legal advisor to Citibank. So Citibank would have been responsible for settling the bill to Clifford Chance. ENS was the legal advisor to Lancaster Group. My understanding is that the bill for ENS was paid out of the 22 million. DM5 was legal advisor to the PIC. My understanding is that PIC as a corporate took care of its own legal costs. Symphony advisor, which was the advisor to Lancaster Group, was paid 76 million, which on the same Annexure E, there is an amount of 76 million that was instructed to be paid out of the escrow account to Symphony.
So the key thing is that did ENS get that full 22 million rands?
My understanding is that it wouldn't have gone to ENS completely. There was a tax portion of it that was paid and it wasn't paid to ENS, and then there was actual advisory legal services that was provided by ENS that was paid. I would have to revert with that information and the breakdown and present it to you, Commissioner.
The second part of the question. Was that 23 million part of the total amount that was made available to Lancaster?
Commissioner, through you, the 22 million plus the 76 to Symphony formed part of the transaction costs, which I think in Table 1, they've been summed up as 100 million. That 100 million formed part of the 9.35 billion loan from the PIC. So to answer your question, yes, Commissioner.
It was capitalized into the transaction.
Yes, that is
Good.
correct.
Thank you.
Just stay with the amounts of money at the moment, because I'm a little bit confused. At one point, if I go back to the deal, it was the PIC to provide a loan, if we go back to 12A, PIC to provide a loan of 9.3 billion, and you said it was then be 9.35 billion, right? Is that correct?
Commissioner, through you, so my statement actually, I think I had omitted a 5, so it has to read 9.35 billion.
Yes, that's what I'm asking there. But then if we go to the following page and we look at the total, which then becomes 9 billion, 100 million, 350 million, which is 9.45 billion. Okay? So there's an additional amount in that. And then there is the 50 million that was contributed, 50 million by Lancaster, 50 million by the GEPF, PIC on behalf of GEPF. Where is that 50 million accounted for in the deal? Or not accounted for in those numbers?
Commissioner, through you, so the point that I was trying to drive in my paragraph 13 and its supporting table was that when the transaction was presented at IC, the costs were that. What had changed as a result of the approvals was the 350 million.
For the collar.
On the collar. So that was reduced to 250 million rands. Then in order to create that alignment of interest and skin in the game, Jayendra Naidu was going to, or was supposed to contribute 50 million.
Right.
And the PIC then matched that 50 million.
Right.
So the presentation that I've provided in Table 1 was what was actually presented. Table 2 was actually what was approved.
Which paragraphs are you referring to now?
So, Commissioner, I'm referring to paragraph 13 and its supporting Table 1. So that was the proposal to the committee.
Okay. That was the proposal, and then in paragraph 2, was that, in paragraph 14, is that the table that was actually approved?
That was the payment as approved.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, the collar now is 250 from 350. Yeah. Paragraph 14. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Commissioner,
Okay.
through you,
Yeah.
yes, that's correct.
Yes, proceed. Yeah. Can you proceed?
Ms. Morove, just as a point of emphasis, if we look at Annexure E, I'd like you to please read into the record paragraph 4 of that payment instruction.
We further instruct you to pay, subject to applicable fees, all interest earned on the deposit balance to Lancaster into the account nominated by Lancaster in the agreement.
Thank you.
A breakdown of the payment for Symphony and Lancaster to be made from joint instructions, Annexure E, was also provided as per the email sent by Symphony.
Can you hold on a bit there? Yeah.
I'm just worried about that for the instruction. Why is the interest paid to Lancaster?
Commissioner, through you, so at the time PIC would have transferred an amount of 9.4 billion rands. And this was prior to the actual execution of the deal. So I could be skewed in terms of the time frame, but let's say the amount was paid a day before the transaction was executed. That amount would be sitting in an account that's accruing interest. So to the extent that there was interest that was accruing in that account, everything that, after settling the fees to the advisors, after paying Citibank for the shares and after paying Steinhoff for the shares, the balance, including the interest that would have been earned, would then be transferred to this account. And that then was the 22 million.
And just to add is that Lancaster is not only Jayendra's Naidu's company, actually it's an SPV between the PIC and Jayendra's company, isn't it?
That is correct. Lancaster Group
Yeah.
is a company 100% owned by Jayendra Naidu. Lancaster 101 is the SPV that is 50% owned by the PIC, 25% owned by Lancaster Group, and 25% by the broad-based component.
Yes, so any interest which comes into L101 is for the PIC and Lancaster Group.
That is correct. It would have been paid to Lancaster 101.
Yes, yes, which is the SPV, yes. Yes, yes, yes.
Can I ask you, just for clarity, give me the total of the amounts approved in paragraph 14?
Commissioner, through you,
As it's reflected there. What is the total?
so the total was 9.4 billion, which I break
No.
down in paragraph
Just
16.
just add that column for me. I mean, I might be wrong, but just add that for me, please.
Which table are we referring
Table
to?
14.
So I'd be very quick in my calculation. The first two, City and Steinhoff, has to be 9 billion. The caller to,
But it's not 9 billion there. I mean, just go by what the figures are there.
it is 9.13 billion. Commissioner, through you. So the acquisition of the non-Delta shares and the acquisition of the Delta shares was 3.91 plus 5.33. That comes to 9.13 billion. Sorry.
9.14, yeah?
Now, I want to look at, it's not just that, I'm asking for the total amount that this costs. So not just the first two, the total. What
Okay.
did this cost?
Commissioner, that comes to 9.59 billion. Without the 200,000 that was paid to
Yeah,
Standard Bank.
it's 9.49 billion besides that 200,000, isn't it? 9.49 billion. 9,490,000,000.
Why don't we take the tea adjournment and you can work on the figures?
I just want us to be consistent about what was actually spent on the deal, and therefore when we refer to it's 4 billion or 4.5 billion or 4.3 billion, that we have one figure that we know this is what the elements of the deal cost, but this is the total cost to the PIC of what it actually spent on the Lancaster deal.
That's understood, Commissioner.
We'll take an adjournment until 11:20.
Can I?
Yes. To
Thank-
say you still under oath.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just to provide a bit of clarity on what we had discussed, in terms of reconciling the approved amount and the amount provided in Table 2 under paragraph 14. So the amount paid to City, which was the 3.9 billion, included the 250 million premium.
You
It's
say it's included, it's there.
It's included in the 9.31 billion. So putting it in, if you tally up that whole table, you will get to 9.5 instead of, close to 9.5 instead of 9.35, and that's because we had been double counting the premium. So if you add the 3.91 plus the 5.33 plus the 76 plus the 72, you will get to 9.35 billion, which was the approved quantum.
Give those figures again, the 3.91, 5.33.
3.91 plus 5.33 plus 76.95 plus 22.85.
That gives you 9.35.
That is correct, Commissioner. That was the amount that was approved.
And then in terms of table 1 in 13, where you've got 9.45?
So table 1 was what was presented. What was presented was acquisition of shares for 9 billion, transaction cost of 100 million, the ratio collar premium at 350 million. This amount then changed to 250 million. What I didn't include in that table is the capitalization of 50 million by the PIC.
So where does that now get reflected, the 50 million capitalization by the PIC?
Pardon me?
Where's that now reflected, that 50 million?
So I would have to have stated it in paragraph two, table number 2. So the loan was actually 9.35. And so as we've just calculated paragraph 2, we get to 9.35. The additional 50 would mean the PIC in total approved 9.4 billion.
Just think it could have worked better maybe if you separated the equity portion, the 50-50, say the 50 million and the 50 million is the equity contribution, and then the other amounts separately. Do you think it could have worked better maybe?
I think so, Commissioner. I will provide a table to that effect to clarify this.
Okay.
But of course, that doesn't change the 9.4 billion. It's still the same amount.
That is correct, Commissioner. There was actually 2 instruments that was created by the PIC. There was an equity instrument for 50 million, and there was a loan instrument for 3.5 billion.
So in total, the PIC paid 9.35 billion, or 9.350 billion plus 50 million of the equity portion, which is 9.4 billion rands, which is 9.4 billion. Is that correct?
That is correct, Commissioner.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
In total, the total amount disbursed by the PIC in relation to Project Sierra was 9.4 billion, as provided in Annex to G, which was composed of 12 payments as follows: 10 payments of 900 million, 1 payment of 350 million, and 1 payment of 50 million. The following advisors were appointed on Project Sierra. Clifford Chance, legal advisors to Citi. ENS, legal advisors to Lancaster Group. DM5, legal advisors to the PIC. Symphony, advisors to Lancaster Group. Scrip lending. The PIC has entered into a global market security lending agreement, GIMSLA, with Citi, under which Citi can borrow Steinhoff shares from the PIC to maintain the ratio collar. The stock loan could be made through intermediaries, including but not limited to Deutsche Bank. I've annexed the GIMSLA agreement in Annexure H. On 5 August 2016, IC approved four board directors for Lancaster SPV, 2 representing the PIC, that is Mr. Roshan Morar and Ms. Boitumelo Mashilane, 1 representing Lancaster Group, and 1 representing the broad-based Empowerment Trust.
Sorry, just on that, at that point in time, did the trust exist, or was it simply a nomination of a person? Do you know?
At that point in time, the implementation of the trust hadn't been completed, but the nomination for that trust member, or the board rep for the trust, had not been made.
It was simply an allocation of a seat, not a person to sit in that seat at that point in time.
That is correct, Commissioner, but in terms of the PIC representatives, those were actually nominated at the IC.
No, I'm only talking about the BE one
Yeah.
at that point.
So you're correct.
Just a question, in terms of the BE Trust, did it ever contribute its portion of 25%?
Through you, Commissioner, I think at the time of the transaction, the intention was not for the trust to contribute to the SPV. Lancaster Group, through Mr. Jayendra's contribution, would then be used as part of the BEE Trust contribution to the entire SPV. So in other words, Mr. Jayendra Naidu actually paid for Lancaster Trust's participation in the SPV. In January 2018, Ms. Boitumelo Mashilane went on maternity leave, and I was then appointed as an alternate director on the board of both 1L101 and 1L102, an entity that I discussed under Project Blueback section below. Simultaneously, Mr. Horatius Maluleka was also appointed as a director on the board of both Lancaster 101 and Lancaster 102, replacing Ms. Boitumelo Mashilane. In May 2017, the PIC received a proposal from Lancaster 101 to consider setting up a non-profit company, MPC, instead of the BBBEE Trust, as per the PIC approval Annexure J. The rationale provided for considering a non-profit company was as follows: the ease of administration and greater transparency in governance, whilst at the same time ensuring limited liability for directors of NPC. The MPC had the added benefits of dividend withholding tax, while the trust would attract withholding tax. The change from a trust to an NCP was approved per the attached Sierra Memorandum named Annexure K, and is captured in the addendum to the shareholders' agreement named Annexure L.
Thanks. Just on that question of this, whether it's a non-profit, which you've now approved in May 2017, just for information, are you still as an alternate on the board?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct, I am.
Do we know the status of this non-profit? Has it been established? Has it got proper terms of reference? Is it something that you as a board member are comfortable with? Has the director to the board been appointed?
Commissioner, through you, the NPC has been established. There's a memorandum of incorporation, I believe, as well as other constitutional documents that pertain to that, which I'm happy to provide. There is a representative of the NCP on the entire Lancaster 101 board and 102 board. That was implemented, I believe, it could have been 2017 when that was implemented. We have been provided with the beneficiaries of the trust, which in my knowledge, it's non-profit organizations in South Africa that deal with education as well as healthcare services to townships in South Africa.
Can I ask that we be provided with, because there's a difference between a trust and the non-profit. I understood that the trust was no longer going to be there, but you'd have a non-profit company. The amount of funds that have gone through this to that non-profit company, and how much has been expended in relation to the work of the non-profit, because I think it was a 25% stake in this for that purpose, and I think it would just be useful to get that information from you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We can provide that. I just want to state, as it relates to the funding of the foundation, I don't cover it extensively in my statement, but there was, as a result of Project Blueback, I think I've provided a table where 50 million was actually approved to capitalize the foundation. That 50 million, and I'll go through the mechanics of Project Blueback, there was a loan that was raised from Citibank to buy shares in Star, and those shares would then be ceded to the PIC as security. Over and above the purchase price for the loan, there was 150 million for value-enhanced strategies that was approved. There was a 50 million to actually capitalize the foundation.
But before Blueback, was there any money that went into L101? Any proceeds, any returns? Because we know Steinhoff fell at some point.
Before Project Blueback, the capitalization of 101 would have been through the 250 million equity contributions by Lancaster and the PIC. So that would have been in 101. And then Blueback came. There was additional money that was obtained as a result of the city loan that now went into Lancaster 101.
Then, yeah, we shall get there. I think let's wait and then we'll get there.
In May 2017, I was tasked to work on Project Blueback in my capacity as an investment associate. I received a copy of an investment proposal prepared by Lancaster Group and Symphony dated 9 May 2017 from Vusi Rasoroka, who was a fund principal in the PIC Private Equity and SIPS division at the time. Within a year of PIC's participation in Project Sierra, the Steinhoff share price began to decline, and this had an impact on the PIC security package under Project Sierra. As a result, Lancaster Group approached the PIC with a proposal for the PIC to consider facilitating Project Blueback, a transaction that would result in the change in PIC's security package to a much more enhanced position. Project Blueback entailed Lancaster Group raising third-party funding from Steinhoff and Citi to acquire a circa 11.8% equity stake in Star through the vehicles Lancaster 101 and Lancaster 102, which the PIC had a shareholding of 50% in. The Star shares acquired through Lancaster 101 and Lancaster 102 vehicles would then be pledged to the PIC to offer an enhanced security package. The transaction mechanics for Project Blueback are summarized as follows. Lancaster 101 would secure a loan from Citi to acquire 5.9% equity stake in Star. The PIC would then have a primary session and pledge over these shares. And Lancaster 102 would then acquire funding from Steinhoff and or its affiliated companies to acquire 5.9% stake in Star. The PIC would then have a reversionary session and pledge over these shares. The mechanics are further demonstrated in that diagram presented below. In terms of the PIC governance process for approving transactions, Project Blueback was then taken to PMC 1, PMC 2, and IC. Project Blueback was taken to PMC 1 to allow the deal team to proceed to due diligence. Although no additional expenses was incurred as due diligence service providers were not appointed, the deal team's due diligence entailed quantifying the impact of the proposed transaction on the PIC. On 13th July 2017, Project Blueback was presented to IC. The IC members requested further comfort on the adequacy of the new security package being presented and wanted a deeper understanding or comparison between the PIC security package under Project Sierra versus Project Blueback. To this end, internal audit was tasked with making the analysis for the benefit of the IC members. The deal team was required to facilitate this by providing internal audit with the requisite information. I've provided an extra M for this. According to the approval letter issued to Lancaster Group by the PIC, provided in Annexure, I'd like to make a correction. I make reference to Annexure M. It's actually Annexure N. The following transaction costs were presented. Capitalization of Lancaster Group Trust for 50 million, investment into value-enhancing strategies for 150 million, transaction costs for 49 million, as well as a restructuring fee to the PIC for 30 million. The total of this was 280 million, provided in Table 3. The following.
Let's just go through a couple of things here. So the trust was given the 50 million, yeah, which is fine. Value enhancing strategies, where was that money deposited? Where was it taken?
The value enhancement strategies allocation for 150 million was borrowed from Citi by Lancaster 101.
Oh, I see. Okay. And to do what?
Commissioner, through you, there isn't really a strategy that was developed, well, a formal strategy that was developed and that would govern the use of the 150 million. But to my understanding is that it would be deployed in various transactions that would provide some sort of upside for Lancaster 101. As far as I know, there is one transaction that has been deployed out of that value enhancement strategy.
Okay. All right, we shall come back. And then transaction costs, what would those be?
Commissioner, through you, my understanding is that the transaction costs for 49 million would be paid to Symphony.
So, okay, I thought transaction meaning maybe some trading of the stocks and, you know.
Commissioner, through you.
Not advisory, probably.
Through you, Commissioner, these were advisory fees that were paid to Symphony.
Was it to Symphony? Because your note in 31C is Ataraxia Capital, not Symphony. Is there a relationship between Ataraxia or a connection between Ataraxia and Symphony?
Commissioner, through you, at the time of doing Project Sierra, we were having discussions and we were working alongside Symphony Capital. I think even in the beginning of Project Blue Buck, we dealt with Symphony Capital. At a later point, the transactors or the faces of Symphony Capital actually broke away and formed their own investment arm called Ataraxia. So I stand to be corrected. I think by the time we concluded this transaction, they had already been labeled as Ataraxia, but in essence, the guys from Symphony, well, two of the guys from Symphony then formed a company called Ataraxia.
But they were advisors to Lancaster, but in total for the deal it would have been the original fee to Symphony of 77 million, as well as this 49 million to Ataraxia for the transaction as a whole that they earned.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Whether they Symphony, Ataraxia, or whichever. The fees paid then would have been the total of the two, 77 plus 49.
That is correct, Commissioner. In Sierra, they got 76. In Bluebuck, they got 49.
I'm rounding up, not down, 76.9, so it might as well be 77, not 76.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Thank you. Can I go back? I don't know whether you were finished there. Yeah? I want to go back to this question of what you had earlier in relation to the new security package and go to your Annexure N in that regard and ask you if you can help me with this. Because the question here is a change of the security package. And if we went to Annexure N, page 2, on the description of rights, the current security, you've got rights, you've got current, it's under 5. You got it?
I've got it, Commissioner.
Okay. So the question, the PIC will subordinate its loan to its loan advance to L101 under Project Sierra, subject to changes in the security packages in the following manner. First of all, the rights primary cession and pledge on L101 shares in Steinhoff. The current under Sierra was that the PIC had 25% of the shares and Citi had 75. Under the security package, Blue Buck, PIC no longer has any percentage and Citi has 100. You have a reversionary cession which looks at the PIC having 100 and the Citi having 0, and then obviously the ratio collar. And in point A, underneath the table, the above changes in security are a result of Citi's funding facilitation of the transaction. Therefore, PIC, as I would understand it, and I would need your guidance on that, as I would understand it, PIC reducing its package from 25% in the shares to 0 facilitated the Citi's funding of that deal. If they had not done that, would that deal have gone through? And what were the implications or the outcome, given the events in Steinhoff and Lancaster and Starr, to the situation as it affects the PIC today on this transaction? What, in actual fact, having lent 9.4 billion rand, is the impact of that loan in its totality, whether it was in the original 101 or 102, and what did this change in security mean in relation to the standing of the PIC today? And the ability for Steinhoff, for Lancaster to have done the second Lancaster 102, because I want to just understand that PIC changing that security, its implications to enable Citi. Would Citi have done the deal if the PIC had not done that?
Commissioner, through you. So my first attempt to that question would be to talk about the first transaction and how the decline in the share price affected it. So PIC had a loan of 3.5 billion, which was being serviced by dividends from Steinhoff shares. And it was actually 25% of those shares because the other had been ceded to Citi. As the share price declined, earnings of Steinhoff also declined, and consequently the dividends outlook on Steinhoff shares would have declined. What that meant for the PIC was that the serviceability of the loan would also decline. So we were brought a proposal by Lancaster Group to consider actually changing our security package from Steinhoff, whose shares were declining in value, to Star, whose outlook on the share price was looking more attractive. The Star shares, our outlook was that the earnings would be growing because of their footprint in Africa, and those markets presented great growth opportunities. If earnings are projected to grow, we also projected that the dividends from those shares would also grow. So in that case, having then had Star as security, and the dividends of Star thereof being ceded to the PIC, that then meant for the PIC that we would be able to get our loan serviced from Star shares, whose dividend outlook was growing, as opposed to Steinhoff, whose outlook was declining. That meant also that the loan that we had advanced to Lancaster 101, the repayment of that loan would be accelerated. So we actually viewed that security package at the time as a much more enhanced position than we would have had in Sierra. When we did our returns calculation on the structure, it wasn't mainly on the loan. So we weren't just looking at the fact that we were providing a loan and we were going to receive interest and that was return. The initial structure was that there was an upside component from it. So we took a view that Steinhoff would appreciate, the share would appreciate in value. What that meant for us is that we would not get just the loan return, we would get a loan plus an upside return, an equity upside return. That provided us with an enhanced return position. If now the Steinhoff share price goes down, that eliminates any possibility of getting upside participation. If we switch now to Star shares, them appreciating in value meant that we would get some form of upside from the Star shares. If we look at the two transactions, line by line, it means now the dividends that we were going to get from Star, which we're no longer now getting from Steinhoff package, would provide us with a better IRR, a better returns. So in that case, we then deemed that as a better security package. For us to facilitate Project Bluebug, we were not actually putting out any capital contribution. We had to forego some of our security. We already had 25% on the Citi shares, which were declining in value. That opportunity cost, if I may call it, came with us actually getting Star shares, which were more accretive on the outlook, was looking far much better. So our facilitation for getting session and pledge of Star shares, which were essentially funded by Citi, was us foregoing the Steinhoff shares. And that was the level of our participation.
So Project Bluebug was leveraged by PIC having foregone its security in Sierra.
That, Commissioner, through you, that was a condition, yes.
And the outcome at this point in time, in terms of the 9.4 billion investment, what is the situation today?
So I can try and, Commissioner, through you, I'll try and recall figures. They might not be accurate, but if I just provide them in numbers, maybe they'll give much more clarity. So the PIC's loan today, as it sits, I think has rolled up to about 11.3 billion, thereabout. That loan was secured in Sierra by Steinhoff shares. The value of the Steinhoff shares that we bought at the time for 9.35 billion, and I think the share price when we did the transaction was 98 rands. Steinhoff share price has now decreased, I think, to about 2 rands or even less. The value of those shares is now about 200 million. If we move to Project Blueback, we still have an outstanding balance of 11.3 billion, but that is secured by shares that were bought in Star using the loan from Citi. I think as we stand, the value of those shares, so the value of Lancaster 101 shares in Star is about 7 billion. So we are looking at an impairment of, the difference between our outstanding balance and Star shares versus our outstanding balance in Steinhoff shares. The gap would have been wider, had it been Project Sierra.
But the impairment is roughly 4.3 billion.
Roughly, that is correct.
So in essence, the full investment at the initial is an impairment.
That is correct, Commissioner.
And just on that question of being secured, I'm just not quite sure if you could explain it a little bit more, that you are secured in the Star shares by the Citi investment. Just explain that a little bit, because you forfeited, the PIC forfeited the 25% to enable the Citi deal to go through in support of Steinhoff. So just explain that secure. I'm not quite sure I follow it.
So Project Blueback, Commissioner, if I may, was a transaction where Lancaster raised the loan, Lancaster 101 raised the loan for 6.5 billion. That loan bought shares in Star. Typically, when a bank or anyone actually loans you funding, you would expect them to have primary cession of the underlying security. In this case, it would have probably made sense if then Citi got 100% of the Star shares in terms of primary cession. What then happened was Citi then got 100% of the Star shares, that is, got a cession and pledge on the 100% of the Star shares, and the PIC got primary cession of the Star shares where the value was projected to grow.
Just to check something, so if the Star shares continue to rise, would the value of the PIC, rise? The amount owed by the PIC rise?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct. If the share price of Star continues to grow, we would assume that the impairment gap will
narrow. Will narrow. Yeah. Have you taken, that sort of, have you taken the sort of have you taken the hit, the 4 billion rent hit, the impairment?
Commissioner, I beg your pardon.
Have you taken the 4 billion rand hit in the balance sheets, or is something which is still,
Commissioner, through you, I think in our last financial year, we did report this impairment. We will only be able to obviously realize it at the end of the maturity of the loan. So for now, we have just reported it as.
And when does the loan mature?
The loan should mature in 2023. It was a 5-year term. I'll just have to check quickly. 22? 2021, thereabout, Commissioner.
Can I just ask a question which I've asked, but perhaps in a slightly different way? Coming back to the Symphony Ataraxia, did PIC in any way influence or recommend the use of either of those?
Commissioner, through you, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware whether PIC had an influence in the appointment of Symphony. or Ataraxia.
You said in your evidence that these were advisors of the Lancaster Group. Were they brought to the PIC, or in bringing the deal to the PIC, were they brought to the PIC as such, as having been the Lancaster Group's advisors?
Thank you, Commissioner. My initial encounter with Symphony Capital was when the deal had already kick-started. So in other words, at the time when I participated in the transaction, they were already representing Lancaster Group.
Your concluding paragraph in the statement, paragraph 32.
IC approved 4 board directors for Lancaster 102, 2 representing the PIC, 1 representing Lancaster Group, and 1 representing the BBBEE Trust in order to replicate 101 structure. I've provided the blue approval in Annex N.
Can I just ask for some clarity, because I might have misunderstood you, and I apologize if I did. But I've tended to hear trust, non-profit, and foundation. You've used all 3. Exactly what have we got here as the non-profit component, the empowerment component of the Lancaster deal?
Commissioner, through you, the initial approval was for a trust. Subsequent to that, about a year later, there was a request to actually convert that trust into a non-profit company.
But the trust had not actually taken shape at that point in time. It was on paper, or was it already in existence as a trust?
It had not been implemented at the time.
So it moved from the approval of a trust to be formed to a non-profit to be formed over a period of a year.
That is correct, Commissioner. As it stands now, we have an entity called Lancaster Foundation. It is not a foundation in my understanding the way we would know it. It is just a term used loosely, and the name of that non-profit company is actually Lancaster Foundation.
But it exists. It's there, it exists.
It does exist.
It has functions, it distributes money.
Yes, Commissioner. I can state as being part of I'm an alternate on Lancaster 101 and 102. I can state on the record that there has been a donation made by the trust to a charitable organization.
The foundation to a charitable organization, not the trust?
And NPC making a donation to a charitable non-profit organization.
You say NPC?
Non-profit company, sorry.
No, yeah. The last I heard was a foundation that has made a donation. Now you say NPC.
Commissioner, if I may clarify, the approval was for a non-profit company. That non-profit company, the name of that entity is Lancaster Foundation.
So we
I
have a
understand.
non-profit company called Lancaster Foundation.
That is correct.
Which is now beginning to distribute some funds to different entities.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Okay, then it's clear, thank you.
Just a question, another question is that what could have happened, and I think you did try to address that, what could have happened if Project Blueback didn't happen? If it was just a Sierra and the share price of Steinhoff kept going down and all that?
Commissioner, through you, the way that the collar was structured was that such that the expiry date would start on year 3 from transaction close or from conclusion of the transaction, which meant that the collar was probably exercisable between years 3 and years 5. The way it also was designed is that this would be done in tranches. And the rationale behind unwinding or the expiry in tranches was that because of the volume and the quantum of the transaction, if it happened that PIC exercised the collar at one go, this would probably distort the market in terms of prices, as it was a big chunk of shares from Steinhoff. So when the share price began to decline, it was within the first year of the transaction being approved. We had not as yet reached year 3 where we could start actually expiring or realizing the proceeds from the collar. So we were faced with a situation where the share price, which was the share price of Steinhoff, was going down, and Steinhoff was very key in terms of the security provided to the PIC. So if the PIC had not changed its position today, we would still not be within year 3 where the ratio collar would have given us the opportunity to unwind it or exit or. So in a nutshell, between the time of concluding the deal in 2016 and now, we were just seeing the decline in share prices, and we had to act accordingly to put a security package in terms of star shares that would provide a better position in terms of our financial position as the PIC.
Okay, just to go back to the foundation, Ms. Murabi, do you know who the entity was, who this entity that they provided funding to? Do you know who they are?
Commissioner, through you, I believe I know that there was a donation in the form of vehicles that was bought for a foundation called Africa Tikkun.
And does that bear any relation to Lancaster Group or the PIC, that entity?
Commissioner, through you, I do not think that the PIC has a relationship with Africa Tikkun. I'd have to check that. I would like to believe that the foundation does not have a relationship with Africa Tikkun, but I would like to have the opportunity to clarify that.
Now, the changes that were effected as a result of the PIC noticing that the share price was going down in Steinhoff, who takes that decision? Is it a particular section of the PIC, the board, some committee?
Commissioner, can I ask you to clarify your question?
You said that the PIC decided to effect changes as a result of the share price in Steinhoff going down. My question is, who took that decision in the PIC on behalf of the PIC?
So the proposal and the initiative to change the security package came about from Lancaster Group. The decision to actually change the security package was made by the IC. Yes.
Investment Committee.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Just in terms of this BE transaction, you know, we need to focus on that there was supposed to be a BE transaction which will make money for the BE sponsors and all that. In total, what has happened to that transaction? Has the BE company made money? Will it make money and all that?
Commissioner, through you, so there was a lot of parameters in this transaction. It was an empowerment transaction in that it facilitated the acquisition by a BEE partner into Steinhoff. Second of all, that BEE partner was going to be active, so, and that was going to be facilitated by the shares that had voting powers. So in other words, Jayendra through Lancaster 101 would be part of the voting pool and therefore would obviously have an influence in terms of the strategic direction that Steinhoff would take. Thirdly, there were KPIs embedded in this transaction that spoke to entrepreneurship development and social development. So those were the key things. In terms of returns, all of that value add, including the KPI initiatives that Jayendra was contracted to do, we saw them as value enhancing. So to the extent that he is able to achieve all of that, that would be translated into a form of return in the end, because essentially he would have been able to derive and drive some value in the investment. So has Lancaster or has the sponsor gotten a return as yet? The answer to that is no. That will be determined when the transaction actually closes, because that is when the upside participation will probably take place, if it is there.
And this will depend a lot on what Star and Steinhoff will do, you know, in the coming years.
Commissioner, through you, that is correct.
So do you think Steinhoff will ever come back?
Commissioner, through you, I think there's a lot of work to be done at Steinhoff level. It's very difficult now to make any assessment because there is no information available on Steinhoff. I do believe, though, that STAR, which is the Steinhoff Africa assets, are a good place for Lancaster Group to be invested in, as their growth projections are much more promising than Steinhoff's.
Have you got any further questions, Mr. Mahapi?
We have no further questions, Mr. Commissioner. That is Ms. Morobe's evidence.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Morobe. You don't have to stand up, that's okay. Thank you very much for your contribution, the evidence that you have placed before us. Certainly, a lot of light has been thrown into the question of Steinhoff and its position. From my side, I think I don't think, it appears to me that you are quite knowledgeable in the field that you are in, and for that we thank you. If it were to happen that we want you to come back, I hope you will be available to come back to give further evidence, that is, if necessary. Okay, thank you so much so far. All right.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, our next witness is Mr. Vusira Soroka. He's ready to come and give evidence.
We don't have to take an adjournment, do we?
No, we don't need an adjournment.
Mr. Mohammed, just in relation to the previous witness, for clarity, given the discussion that was there, can we get the details of exactly who the BBBEE partner is, what its composition is, who sits on the board, what their terms of reference are, who the beneficiaries are? They've said Africa Tikon, is that the only one? What was the quantum distributed, and what are their plans for distribution? So we have a sense of what that 25% of this deal actually entails and who's involved in it, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll provide that to the Commission. Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Rasrug is ready to take the prescribed oath.
Thank you. Your full name, sir?
Commissioner, my full names are Rampomani Vusumuzi Rasaloka.
I didn't get the first one.
Rampomani Vusumuzi Rasaloka.
Okay. I take it you have no objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No objection, Commissioner.
Can you please stand then? Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you. Mr. Rasroka, you've also prepared a statement in relation to the evidence you'll be giving before the Commission. Is that correct?
That is correct, Commissioner.
Can we start from paragraph 1 of your statement?
Okay. I'm an adult male and currently employed by the Public Investment Corporation, PIC, as a fund principal, private equity and structured investment products. I've been in the employ of the PIC since February 2010.
Previous witness, seeing that you are the fund principal and she's associate principal, what's the difference? And is she under you, or how is the structure?
Through you, Chair, in terms of the structure, you'd have the executive head of private equity and SIPs. Thereafter, or below them, reporting to them would be the fund principal, and reporting to a fund principal would be an associate fund principal and an associate and an analyst. Through you, Chair, in my original statement, I did not include my qualifications and my employment at the PIC.
Okay, you can state them for the record.
Okay. I was employed by the PIC in February 2010 as a portfolio manager in economic infrastructure in the Isibaya Fund team. In November 2013, I moved from the developmental investments team, which was into the private equity team as an associate principal. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Commerce accounting degree from the University of Botswana, and I'm a fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, FCCA. The facts contained in this statement are, to the best of my knowledge and belief, both true and correct. I have been requested to give evidence in relation to my role in the Steinhoff Lancaster 101 transaction, and I do so voluntarily.
The one thing I just wanted to check, Mr. Rasaroko, or to Advocate Mohapi, is that how different is this statement to the previous one in many ways? They seem to be similar.
Commissioner, there are similarities, but there are things which Mr. Rasoroka fleshes out more in detail. So there is more detail which he deals with, particularly in Lancaster 101.
All right. Okay, thanks.
My first encounter with the transaction was on the 19th of May 2016, when I was sent a meeting invite by Mr. Mervyn Muller. I accepted the meeting on the following day, 20th May 2016, and on that same day, I also received an email from Mervyn, an extra one, Project Sierra initiation email and attachments thereto. The email had 2 attachments, namely Project Sierra investment proposal prepared by Symphony Capital, the Lancaster Group appointed advisors, and a PIC letter investment proposal from Mr. Jayendra Naidu.
I think, Mr. Rasroga, just because the bulk of what you cover in the following paragraphs is dealt with by the previous witness, can we jump over to section D of your statement, paragraph 14?
Citibank scrip borrow. In terms of the Sierra transaction, given its size, it was necessary.
Okay, sorry, just before you start, just a broad question is, how did this transaction get to the PIC? Who actually brought it to the PIC?
Through you, Chair, I received an email from Mr. Mervyn Muller, but when I look into the email trail, I note that there was an email from Mr. Jayendra Naidu, I believe, to Dr. Majila. And thereafter, Dr. Majila then circulated it amongst a number of executives within the PIC.
Would that be what is referred to in 5.2, paragraph 5.2?
That is correct, Chair. Commissioner, my apologies.
Paragraph 6 also does talk about it too.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Yeah. Okay.
Perhaps then, just for the record, we can deal with paragraphs 5, 6.
The email had 2 attachments, namely Project Sierra investment proposal prepared by Symphony Capital, the Lancaster Group appointed advisors, and a PIC letter investment proposal from Mr. Jayendra Naidu. The email was originally from Mr. Naidu to Dr. Dan Majila, who had then forwarded the email to the following people: Mr. Mervyn Muller and Mr. Fidelis Madavu, with copies to Mr. Koketso Mabe, Ms. Matsepo More, and Mr. Sholto Dolamo. Citibank scrip borrow. In terms of the Sierra transaction, given its size, it was necessary for the team to put in place a lender of last resort arrangements for securities lending, wherein Citibank Citi would approach the PIC as a last resort to borrow Steinhoff shares. This arrangement would only take place if Citi had failed to find borrow shares securities on the open market. As the transaction involved a large block of shares, and one of the parties to the transaction was the PIC, it was important for the parties to include the lender of last resort arrangements in order to facilitate Citi's ability to manage the options under all circumstances. The PIC entered into a global master securities lending agreement, GIMSLA, with Citi/101, L101. During December 2017, after the Steinhoff share collapse on the 6th of December 2017, Citi approached the PIC to borrow shares under the lender of last resort arrangement to enable Citi to better manage the delta. The delta refers to the degree which the put options and the call options entered into by 101 would be exposed to the changes in the underlying Steinhoff share price. As at December 18, 2017, we received an email from the PIC's head of quants derivatives listed investments that 33 million borrow Steinhoff shares had been returned by Citi. To my knowledge, there are still outstanding borrow shares as the management of the delta by Citi is ongoing and the share borrow fees continue to be charged to L101. An extra 5 Sierra stock loan correspondence. The BBBEE Trust, as part of the resolution giving approval to the Sierra transaction by the PIC Investment Committee, it was recorded that the shareholding of L101 would be made up as follows: Lancaster Group 25%, GPF 50%, a broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Trust 25%, BBBEE Trust. This requirement to establish the BBBEE Trust then became an obligation on Lancaster Group, Lancaster 101, as a result of the resolution. In May 2017, communication was received from L101, being a document that served before the L101 board. The document related to discussions at the L101 board about the implementation of either a trust or a non-profit company in fulfillment of the PIC's approval requirement that L101 establish a BBBEE Trust to hold a 25% equity stake in the group. The implementation of the specific type of BBBEE Trust, or NPC, was motivated by the L101 board, and they would have had to have obtained the PIC shareholder approval. The investment team circulated a memo for a PMC to provide shareholder approval by way of a round robin. It was compiled by Ms. Buzam Morobe. Following the signing of the internal memo, despite numerous attempts to follow up with other departments such as ESG and Company Secretariat, there was nothing forthcoming in respect of the round robin approval by PMC. It has recently come to my attention that the PIC shareholder representative CEO did give approval for the formation of the BBBEE NPC, an extra 6 BBBEE Trust NPC motivation and approvals. Paragraph F, was Sierra being monitored by PMV? The Sierra transaction was not monitored by PMV. It is my understanding that the reason for this was historical, as SIPs from their inception were never monitored by PMV, rather they were monitored by the PE team, by the private equity team. Furthermore, the SIPs process facilitates transformation on listed companies, and PMV does not monitor listed investments due to the PMV process requiring the company to commit to an information undertaking that would result in PMV receiving management accounts and having access to management. This would result in PMV having access to market-sensitive information, resulting in information asymmetry.
Okay. I just want to ask a very broad question, to get some help from you as a fund principal, Mr. Razorok. This transaction has been in the media for a while and all that. So I just want to find out where the issues about these things I'm going to mention, 2 buckets of things, okay? The discontent about this transaction, was it about because it was done by one person who's a PEP, looks like he's a PEP, or was it because Steinhoff collapsed? Was it because the BBBEE Trust was not formed? That is sort of one group of the issues. The second group, could it be that the PIC processes were flouted or whatever, or there were some payments which were not sort of regular and all that? So I'm just trying to find out what could be the angst here about this transaction, according to you?
Through you, Commissioner. In my opinion, there are probably two key issues that would have caused the angst around this transaction. I think the first one would have been that it was a transaction that was led by one person, being Mr. Jayendra Naidu. And I think, this was recognized by the investment committee as the Sierra transaction was being approved, and hence the requirement to then change the shareholding to include a BE trust. The second issue would have been as a result of the Steinhoff collapse, where I think a lot of people in the investment industry had invested in Steinhoff, and as a result of the collapse, their investments were substantially reduced in value. And so from my perspective, the issue then became one around, with specific reference to the PIC, would be one around, was the PIC able to foresee that this was going to happen? And what, if it was, how did this relate to the PIC's ability as a fund manager to manage the government employee pension funds? I think that's in my view, that's the second issue. With regards to the BE trust, I think the BE trust came out of IC, and so at the time when the approval was done, the BE trust was not, or post this transaction coming into the public domain, the BE trust was already part of the structure. And then with regards to the PIC processes being flouted, to my knowledge, the PIC processes were not flouted. I think throughout in the annexures we show the process, that this transaction went through from approval, including the approval of the BE trust. With regards to irregular payments, on the surface, I do not see any irregular payments, but as to whether, behind the scenes and outside of the purview of the PIC, there were, it's anyone's guess.
Yeah, since the condition relating to the BBBEE requirement came from the IC, did the CEO have authority to change it? I think in paragraph 23, you mentioned that at page 11, that it has recently come to my attention that the PIC shareholder representative, CEO, did give approval to the formation of the NPC. Shouldn't it have gone back to the IC to consider that?
Chair, I'd need to come back to you with the section of the delegation of authority, if indeed he did have the authority to change it.
So meaning that, I mean, given what you have just said, once the BEE issue has been addressed in terms of, you know, the one person versus more people, then you have dealt with the BEE part of the transaction. And the collapse of Steinhoff, probably people couldn't oversee that one, I guess. And then you mentioned the payments. You are just saying where you're not sure is that the payments, once they leave the PIC, you're unsure, and maybe there could be issues there which nobody knows. Is that correct? Yeah?
Commissioner, through you, that is correct. I think the point that I was really trying to make was that where the PIC would receive, would make payments on the basis of information that it has been told by the sponsor. If a sponsor then goes and does something else once the money is within their bank account, we would not necessarily have sight of that.
A slightly different question. A lot of this transaction revolves around the use of Steinhoff shares or access to Steinhoff shares that the PIC had. And in the question from Citi, it says this number that they have access to for the use of the maximum loan securities referenced before is 51.5 million shares, and then there's an outstanding amount of 33 million shares. What we've been focusing so far in this hearing today about the Lancaster component of the Steinhoff deal, but what was the PIC's exposure to Steinhoff itself? How much and at what price did it buy the shares? Obviously, it might have bought over a period of time, but if you had to look at it average, looked at before the Steinhoff collapse, what was the value of Steinhoff in the PIC, and what is the value today of the Steinhoff holding in the PIC unrelated to Lancaster?
Through you, Commissioner, that information would reside within the listed investment space, and
if you don't know, that's not a problem. Yeah. We can find that out. I just think that when one's looking at this as a component using Steinhoff shares, it's important to look at what actually was the exposure, the commitment to Steinhoff, what was the total investment in Steinhoff, and then what is that current investment worth. So if you took the day before the Steinhoff collapse, PIC's investment in Steinhoff, today what is that investment worth? And therefore, there are two elements of outstanding exposure, or one would not necessarily be an exposure, but a significant cost to the PIC in terms of its investment. So if we could get that information as distinct from the Lancaster deal.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will obtain that info.
Section G, L102, Blueback. The shareholding in L101 was replicated in L102 in order to ensure a common ownership structure for the two companies. The structure was also included the addition of cross-default provisions that were placed in both L101 and L102. This was done to ensure shareholder alignment across both companies by ensuring that the whole group had a similar ownership structure, as well as ensuring that the group as a whole was equally at risk in the event of there being any unmitigated risk at either one of the two entities, L101 and L102. Steinhoff Africa Retail, STAR, shares were as security in Blueback. The investment thesis around the Blueback transaction was as follows. Given the decline in the Steinhoff share price, Steinhoff began a process of separately listing its Africa businesses from the rest of its other businesses, Steinhoff. This resulted in the creation of Steinhoff Africa Retail, STAR. The Bluebug transaction was based on the PIC effectively selling or giving up its first-ranking security position to Citibank in exchange for a loan from Citibank in the amount of 6.5 billion to L101. There's a slight correction there, Commissioner. It should read L101, not L102. And on the following line, it should also read L101. These proceeds would be used by L101 to acquire STAR shares and pay costs. The PIC would then take a first-ranking security position on the STAR shares acquired. As part of the Bluebug transaction, there was agreement that Steinhoff would provide L102 with facilitation. So this should also, there's a slight correction there as well, Commissioner. This should read this should be match funding of 6.5 billion as opposed to 4 billion, 6.5 billion.
6.5 billion.
So it was supposed, Commissioner, it was supposed to be matched funding, so it was to match the funding received from Citi. This debt funding was to enable L102 to ultimately obtain a further exposure in STAR once STAR had completed a part acquisition of ShopRite and the L102 shares in ShopRite had been exchanged for STAR shares. Annexure 7, Project Bluebug IC submissions.
Which never happened.
That never happened,
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Okay.
Once the transaction was approved by the last investment committee, IC, the IC then proceeded to determine who the PIC would nominate as its two directors on the board of L101. The two nominees were Ms. Butimela Mashilani and Mr. R. Mora. At the time of this nomination, Mr. Mora was also the chair of the PIC investment committee that approved Project Sierra.
Was there no question about a conflict of interest if you're chairing the investment committee and that approves it and then you sit on the board?
Commissioner, through you, to my recollection, there was none.
I don't think there was a conflict, or there was no discussion about it?
Through you, Commissioner, there was no discussion about it.
Do you perhaps know how Mr. Mora was nominated onto the board?
In the committee, through you, Chair, in the committee, there was a general discussion and he was nominated.
Was that after the approval had been done?
That was after the approval, Commissioner. Reducing the amount of the transaction from 10.4 billion to 9.4 billion. I am not aware of any official reason to reduce the transaction amounts of the Sierra transaction to 9.4 billion. I can only speculate that the reduction was to enable the transaction to fall within the mandate limit of IC in terms of the specific product category, which, if exceeded, would have resulted in the transaction needing to go to the full PIC board for approval. This would have had the effect of lengthening the transaction timelines, whereas the transaction needed to meet the timeline set by Steinhoff as a result of that closed period, which was to begin during circa the first week of August 2017. There's a slight mistake there. There's an omission there, Commissioner. After August should read 2017. Correction, 2016. 2016, not 2017.
August? Okay, all right.
Is it now 2016?
It's 2016. It's Commissioner, through you, it's in reference to Project Sierra, which was in 2016. This would have precluded the trade. This would have precluded the trade on the portion of shares, 43%, which were to be purchased from the Steinhoff affiliate from happening, as they would not have been able to trade during the closed period.
And, I mean, would you say this happens typically, to ensure that the transaction comes below some threshold to just fast track it? I mean, this is normal, isn't it?
Commissioner, through you, it happens.
There is no sinister motives about it and all that.
Through you, Commissioner, I think in this instance, in my understanding, it was not sinister. It was really around the transaction timelines were quite tight, and to then extend the transaction would have meant that the transaction would have only been effected after the closed period ended.
Fair enough, yeah, fair enough.
But the question, of course, is not about whether it is sinister. It's a question about whether due process and governance is followed. You have the rules of a transaction above 10 billion going to the board. The delegation of authority is that you don't have to go to the board. The investment committee can take a decision if it's below that. If it is common practice that you ensure all your decisions are below the 10 billion, you're bypassing the board's authority and the intent of the delegation of authority. So in terms of the terms of reference of this commission, it becomes a governance issue, not whether it's sinister in a sense of corruption or something else, but it is a decision to bypass the delegation of authorities and good governance in the PIC, or it could be interpreted that way if this is something that happens on a regular basis. So it's easier to get it through in terms of the timelines and the pressures, which may be very real, but you have governance there for a reason.
Clarification.
You can comment if you can.
Through you, Commissioner, the Commissioner is absolutely correct. If it's an ongoing, if it's something that happens regularly, then the Commissioner is absolutely correct. As to whether it does happen regularly, I'm not in a position to say due to the fact that I would not be present in those committees other than when I am a transactor on a transaction.
But perhaps for the investigative team, it might be useful to look at a period, let's say 2016 to the beginning of 2019, 3 years, how many deals above 10 billion were presented to the board, to the full board of the PIC for its consideration?
Thank you, Commissioner. We will obtain that and provide it to the Commission.
Paragraph J, Project Sierra transaction fees. The ratio collar premium in Sierra was 350 million rands. In transactions where a put option to provide downside protection is bought, a put premium is typically payable. The put premium typically ranges between approximately 9 to 12% of the total share price. In Sierra, therefore, this would have resulted in a put premium on 9.35 billion of between 841 million and 1.1 billion respectively. In order to offset and/or reduce the put premium, it is possible to sell a call option wherein one gives away the upside potential of the share. The proceeds from the sale of the call option are then used to offset the cost of the put premium. On Sierra, this process was able to get the ratio collar premium to 350 million, which was payable to Citibank. Just clarification there, Chair. In terms of the 350 million, the 350 million was essentially what was approved, but in actual fact, what happened was it was less.
Actual amount paid was 250 million.
Yes. Project Bluebuck transaction fees. In Project Bluebuck, transaction fees were approved by the PIC. Correction. In Project Bluebuck, transaction fees that were approved by the PIC amounted to 280 million, broken down as follows. 50 million due to the BBBEE Trust, 150 million due to L101 for the value enhancement strategies approved under Project Sierra, 49 million for Symphony / Ataraxia Capital's fees. I have no knowledge of the fee split, if any, and a 30 million rand payment for the PIC. The PIC charged a fee on SIPs in the past. The quantum of the fee charged was subjective.
Can we just find out from the investigative team in relation to 38.3 what that split was? Because obviously Symphony had been the start and then Ataraxia became the finish of the two deals. Okay, if we can get that split.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will obtain it.
Just some clarity. On Section K, the 6.5 billion rand raised for STAR, was this the money that paid some of these costs? Am I correct there?
Through you, Chair, the 6.5 billion loan that came from City to L101, within there were fees, and these are the fees that were to be paid, and this is what was approved by the PIC-IC.
The 150 in value enhancement strategies, this is in L101, and of course I would assume that the PIC people sit there and the Lancaster people. What are those strategies? What is it? Just explain to us.
Through you, Chair, the value enhancement strategies sit within the shareholder agreement.
Okay.
Which is Annexure 3. So in Annexure 3, there were, as part of the transaction, KPIs were set for Lancaster. So under the shareholders agreement in Annexure 3, page 30, section 21, it lays out the key performance indicators, undertakings that L101 needed to achieve.
That explains the KPIs for the investment. It does not explain why it requires 150 million. I would have thought if you're buying into an entity, your job is to make it perform better. That is why you're there. Why would you need another 150 million to do that? Why would there be payment in the first place?
So, through you, Chair, I can only surmise that in terms of the Bluebuck proposal, the L101 or Lancaster Group, or the proposer in this instance, indicated that in order to potentially help them achieve some of these KPIs, they believe that they would need some level of funding to help them achieve those.
Perhaps we should maybe ask PMV to tell us if, that cash, is it still there? Has it been used? What kind of projects were done? Does PMV follow this monitor L101 and 102?
Through you, Commissioner, PMV doesn't monitor L101, L102. So the private equity team, so the reliance is really on the private equity team and ESG to monitor the implementation of these. I think in the Blueback approval, in the Blueback scoping report, there is, so under Annexure 7, on page 17.
17, eh? Page
17.
Yes, yes.
There was an update to the investment committee on the achievement of some of the KPIs. So, in terms of the ongoing achievement of these KPIs, the PE team / some of the people or my colleagues who sit on the board are in a position to detail exactly what has been achieved in terms of the KPIs.
I mean, we're not attacking people or whatever. We just want to see how things have gone and, how is this seems to be a good project, how it's going, Yeah. Yeah? Make sense? Yeah.
Through you, Commissioner, it does. We will endeavor to get that information to the Commission.
I understand the KPIs. I don't necessarily understand the funding as to why you would need 150 million to do what you are brought in as a partner to do. Be that as it may, I think that would be helpful to get an idea of what, beyond what is put there, because there are quite a few no's in that performance. And then just in the Bluebuck transaction, because it was indicated in the L101, there was no advisor to the PIC. Was there any advisor to the PIC in L102?
Through you, Chair, there were no. Through you, Commissioner.
Just done internally.
Pardon, Commissioner?
Just done internally.
Through you, Commissioner, it was done internally.
Mr. Commissioner, that's Mr. Rasaroka's evidence.
Just to check the final question, the 50 million equity portion that Lancaster was supposed was paid. Was it paid? Was it paid, and was it paid in cash?
Through you, Commissioner, I have no knowledge of whether it was paid, but it is information that we can get for the Commission.
Yes, please do. Please do. Yeah.
I suppose you know what 50 million is being referred to.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Yes, if that is it, thank you so much, Mr. Rasaroka,
Thank you, Commissioner.
for the information that you've placed before us. It's very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, I see that we are 5 minutes to 1, and perhaps...
Might as well take the agenda.
That's
Have you got another witness?
Mr. Monahela would be leading the next witness.
Thank you so much. We'll then adjourn until 2 o'clock.